to my second NFL exit report try for the Dallas Cowboys today. First one had a little bit of glitch, but as we move over to the NFC, I've done 15 of 16 AFC teams, saving Kansas City, saving Philadelphia for after the Super Bowl. Those will be the last two teams I cover. But today we cover Dallas, and Dallas is a very tricky team to cover, let me tell you that. We'll get into some of the key words and phrases I use for Dallas. Sometimes they're one of the top teams. Sometimes they're underachievers. They can be all over the place. Now, if we start by looking back at 2021, and when I do my analysis in the offseason, I've talked about that on many videos with Chris, with Ted, when I'm a guest on other shows. The process is year-round. Getting ready for a team requires a look back at the previous season and a look at what goes on in free agency, the draft, everything that comes into week one, and then what happens week 1 to 4, turning over the stats to the 2022 data. It's a whole process that goes on year-round. So with Dallas, pretty successful season in 2021 if you look back. Dak Prescott came back from injury, 69%, 37 touchdown passes, 10 interceptions. You really can't top that. That's really a ceiling year for him. So unfortunately, my first thought after seeing those numbers in 2021 was that's the best he's going to be able to do for 2022. By the same token, they had a mediocre for them 41 defensive sacks. There was room for improvement there. They held opposing teams to only 33 sacks on Dak Prescott, so that was pretty good. But now we were going to see in the offseason that there were going to be some defections and some serious injuries as far as the Dallas Cowboy offensive line. But pretty good at that point. But then we get into the trouble spots. Free agency. Let me pull this particular banner up first. This is a year-long thing. This is not started for 2022, but anybody who thinks that Jerry Jones is such a state-of-the-art, assertive, go all-in type of general manager, owner, ball boy, whatever you want to call Jerry Jones, he's not that at all. So many times in the past, he has talked about adding certain players, but he doesn't add certain players. This year it was Odell Beckham. Previous years, it's been a number of defensive players. Then teams have leapfrogged him in the draft and taken a wide receiver that he coveted or taken an offensive or defensive lineman that he's coveted. He is basically mostly talk, all smoke, and he's not delivering the results. Now, Dallas, if you look back, Washington was a mess. The New York Giants, they were a mess, a real mess heading into at the end of 2021. And the Philadelphia team that had made the playoffs in 2021, yes, they were getting better, but they did not beat any playoff team in 2021. There was still perceived to be a gap between Dallas and Philadelphia, but with every month that passed on the 2022 calendar, that gap closed. If you look back at what happened in free agency, they lost 2 offensive linemen, wide receiver Amari Cooper, their top tight end, and one of their pass rushers. The way that they tried to replenish them is not necessarily through free agency. Again, this was a very passive free agency for Jerry Jones in Dallas, not a surprise in my eyes. But what they did in the draft is they filled behind. They drafted a tight end. They drafted an offensive lineman who, due to injury, would end up playing more offensive tackle, left tackle, than either right tackle or offensive guard. But they went ahead and did a nice job of focus and replacing some of the stars lost with new talent. Now, there was going to be a drop because these were all rookies and they weren't necessarily marquee rookies, but at least they were filling holes and they recognized what needs they had. Now, I mentioned the divisional gap began to close. Philadelphia went out and got a splash wide receiver in a trade with Tennessee. They added A.J. Brown. Philadelphia went out and took the New York Giants, one of their top, if not the top cornerback, Bradbury, and inserted Bradbury into their starting lineup. And instantly that had an effect on Philadelphia's pass defense, as I'll talk about much later on when I get to Philadelphia. And then there were a couple of other additions, including in the season itself when they added Ndamukong Suh. But all this to say is that when I started looking at my keys in July and in August, and I put these keys on my individual team sheets that I would use throughout the season to record data and the stuff that I talk about in the summer, where I'm actually recording notes, what my expectations are week 5, week 6, week 7. Well, I could see that Dallas was not going to be as good as some people thought, yet still should be favored or co-favored to win the division because they still had Dak Prescott. They were incorporating Tony Pollard more in the offense, which was a very good thing. CeeDee Lamb was emerging as a top-tier wide receiver even after just 1 year. And they had a lot of good defensive parts still. So team key number 1 was how much regression would there be in stats and turnover ratio? Because there had to be some with losing Amari Cooper, with losing 2 offensive linemen and so on. Their turnover ratio was what I thought at the time an unsustainable plus 14 for 2021. Again, each turnover is worth 3.5 points in the NFL, according to my numbers. And believe me, these numbers are correct. So if you look at 14 turnovers, that's almost 50 points. If they went to a +0 turnover ratio, they would lose 50 points from a year ago in that turnover advantage. Now, I didn't expect them to lose 50 points. Dak Prescott was still pretty much going to be a careful quarterback. They have some guys in the secondary that are risk takers. So I still expected maybe +4 to 7 in terms of turnover ratio, but there would be some regression. Now, we all know in hindsight what happened, but this is what I'm thinking again in August. As it turned out, they had a +11 turnover ratio, so it didn't really go that far down. Now, my second key is the offensive line healthy enough? And I had some question about that. They had some question about that in terms of the health at the beginning of the year, and it was true much of the year. But they had an experienced quarterback for most of the year in Dak Prescott, and they worked around that. Now, the run game wasn't quite as dynamic as it had been in the past. But one of the reasons was that Ezekiel Elliott, he's just basically, his yards per carry has regressed over the last 2-3 years, and it regressed again this year. So having Tony Pollard more in the offense, that helped. There were still enough weapons on offense and still enough creative play calling that I did think that they were still going to be able to score points. The question was, how fast were all these changes going to take place? Was Dallas legitimately the best team in the NFC East? I made no season win decisions. I did not back them. I did not fade them. I thought they would be worse than last year. My power rating number was about 1.5 points lower than what they finished last year at. But by the same token, even though I knew Philly was improved, I had no expectation that Washington or the New York Giants were going to be in the mix. As it turns out, both of those teams overachieved for various reasons. We'll get into that when I do their offseason exit reports. But Dallas still, to me, was a playoff-worthy team and was priced correctly at around the 10-win total. So I made no decisions regarding season wins. So it was interesting how the season played out. Right away, they laid a dud week 1. But as we all know, people have done this for years and years and years, such as myself. Week 1 is overreaction. It's all overreactions. I've seen teams win their first game, Jacksonville, for instance, and never win another game. And San Francisco beat the Rams 1 year, and they had 2 wins the whole year, week 1 and week 17 when they beat the Rams again. So week 1 can be a vast overreaction, and there are a number of reasons, one of which is preseason usage. I mean, some of these guys, they don't even play in preseason. Cincinnati, the Rams, the Chargers, they don't play their starters. And unfortunately, Dallas did the same, but so did Tampa. But Dallas's performance against Tampa was just not very good, and it immediately caused some red flags. In addition to that, we found out that Dak Prescott, who played that whole game, was going to miss some time right after that, and Cooper Rush was the quarterback weeks 2, 3, 4, and 5. But a funny thing happened week 2, 3, 4, and 5. Cooper Rush led them to a 4-0 record. How did that happen? Very simply, because week 2, 3, 4, and 5, this team went from 2 sacks to 20 sacks. They had 18 sacks in a period of 3 weeks, and actually 22 sacks in a period of 4 weeks. The pass rush was formidable. It actually exceeded my expectations. It would be a pass rush that at one point in the season, just barely over half the season, 9 games in, had 42 sacks, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10 games in, they had 42 sacks. That they were number one at that point. Them and Philadelphia were neck and neck at that particular point. Obviously, getting to opposing quarterbacks keeps you in games, and they were 4-1. Unfortunately, Cooper Rush had a negative game. They had 3 turnovers that led to a -3 turnover ratio, their worst turnover ratio performance of the season at the very worst time, a game at Philly. Philly continues to be undefeated after that game. We know they were the last team standing in terms of when they took their first loss. They went a long way. And Dallas moved to 4-2, and all of a sudden, Dallas was coming from behind, still a very, very much in the playoff race. But if they don't win the division, they're going on the road. They're going to be at best the number 5 seed. And there were some cracks in the armor at this particular point. You could see the offense was floundering a little with Cooper Rush. They went immediately back to Dak Prescott after that. But he ran hot and cold, to be honest. He had a few more turnovers than expected. The offense was very good against teams such as Minnesota and the New York Giants. They scored 40 against Minnesota. Minnesota had a tremendous record and had tremendous personnel, but as we know now, they were more of a pretender than contender. And the New York Giants, a great year and obviously a well-coached team. But Dallas had more personnel. Dallas was able to win that game against Daniel Jones and the New York Giants, and they put up 28 points against the New York Giants defense. So there were still enough weapons to get the job done. They were still very much in the playoff race, and when Hurts went down, they stayed in the playoff race all the way until the end when we saw Dak Prescott, Mike McCarthy, Kellen Moore, and everybody in charge with putting together a Dallas game plan, put in probably their worst performance of the season. I think it was a 26-6 loss, if I'm correct, against Washington. In a game Washington didn't have anything to play for, but Dallas was still in the running. If Philly lost against the New York Giants and if Dallas won, Dallas was all of a sudden going to have home field advantage and have a very, very high seed in the playoffs. It didn't happen. They were the number 5 seed. They went ahead and they went to the playoffs. And the playoffs, here's how I sum up the playoffs. You could see it in the banner below. I'll just read it off to you. It's another reminder of how inconsistent this team can be. A Mike McCarthy coach team just has so many highs and so many lows. And one particular day, take that day against Tampa when they frustrated Tom Brady at Tampa, Dallas could look like one of the top 5 teams in the league. They can play with Philly. They could play with Cincinnati, Buffalo, Kansas City, and I'm missing one team in there. But they can play with all those teams, San Francisco included. But then the very next week at San Francisco, they don't look very good. Even though they're in the game all the way, there were some play calls that they made in that game that have you shaking your head. I mean, they had numerous chances in the red zone. In this day and age of offensive football, you cannot settle for field goals. The Dallas Cowboys settled for field goals. Their season ended again without a championship, an NFC championship, not even getting to the NFC championship game. I'm not saying that the window period is over for the Dallas Cowboys. There are a lot of young parts in that. But what you want to do is strike while Dak Prescott is in his prime. That may last 2 years. That may last 4 years. We don't know. But if you have to groom another quarterback after Dak Prescott, you're going to have a little bit of reloading and a rebuilding time. This is a time that Dallas has to strike. especially when all the top quarterbacks seem to be in the AFC. This is Dallas's moment to shine. And unfortunately, we still see bets of inconsistency from the Dallas Cowboys. So I have a lot of closing thoughts, and I'm going to read them off on my sheet because I took a lot of notes as far as where I think Dallas went in 2022 and where they might go as far as the rest of 2022. Basically, I still don't think that they could do any better than their plus 11 turnover ratio of this year, plus 14 for next year. They're not going to steal free points in 2023. At the best, they're going to be flat in that area. This team needs to be more aggressive in free agency. Jerry Jones, don't just talk the talk, but walk it a little bit. Make a splash move while the iron is hot. Get a top-tier free agent offensive lineman. Sign another wide receiver to go with CeeDee Lamb. Just the same way Chase and Higgins complement each other, the same way Brown and Smith in Philadelphia complement each other. Go ahead and add another cover safety or a linebacker to supplement Parsons. Do not sit on your behind, but actually go out and make some big moves for some good players. You have a decision to make on Ezekiel Elliott. They want him back, but Ezekiel Elliott is negative variance when he's in the game. When Ezekiel Elliott plays, it's basically you're telling the team that he's going to run maybe 4 yards per carry. And I got to tell you, that's music to the ears of defenses. They'd rather see Ezekiel Elliott in the game, maybe not in closing situations where he can push the pile on 3rd and 1 to protect a lead in the 4th quarter. But at all other times, Tony Pollard and diversifying the pass attack is more important than Ezekiel Elliott. Personally, I would cut him and save the cap room, but it's up to them what they would do there. Now they have a new offensive coordinator. McCarthy is going to call the plays. Again, is he going to be like Shanahan or like Belichick or some of these others who vary their game plan week to week? Is he going to be that creative, or is he going to fall into the trap of teams are going to know how his game plans are going to work after game 3, 4, 5? Does he always call running plays on first down? Does he have a kind of a set thing? Is he going to vary what he does depending on what defenses that he faces, depending on what quarterbacks he faces? I have a concern about Mike McCarthy calling the plays. This is an area that we're going to have to watch closely. It's one of those areas, even though in August, the preseason doesn't mean as much as it used to mean. But I tell you, I get a lot of information when I watch new coaches and new coordinators in action in August. And I'm going to be watching Mike McCarthy and his play calling very, very closely. Right now, I'm more of a lean fade for Dallas. And here's why. I think the division is going to get tougher. The New York Giants overachieved with a tremendous change with their head coach. They have a strong GM. If they replicate anything that they did in the draft, which was my number 3 draft last year, the Giants are going to be more formidable. Washington's not going away. They're probably close to a 50-50 team, but they're going to learn from last year. They may have better health on the defensive line, as we'll talk about in the next exit report. Meanwhile, Dallas, I'm not comfortable right now, as we speak before the draft, that Jerry's going to have a great draft. He hasn't had a lot of great drafts. He tends to hit in rounds 1 and 2, and he tends to miss after that. We'll see how deep a draft this is. We'll see what impact free agency has. But I have a feeling the other teams are going to catch up a little bit more to what Dallas is going to do. If they put too high a number on Dallas, if they put another 10 number on Dallas, I might be tempted right now. I reserve the judgment to change, where I could see fading them or putting even a no on where they go. So I'm cautiously pessimistic of Dallas replicating some of the stats that they've had moving forward. That's my look forward in terms of the Dallas Cowboys, the first team I'm previewing in the NFC East. Thank you all. I see Russell and Hey, Why Not 20 putting in some comments here. So you may be watching live. Thank you so much for doing that. Everybody else who watches this, please go ahead and comment, challenge me on Dallas. Maybe you're higher on Dallas than I am. but I just see them as an incomplete team and an inconsistent team. Up next, later today, I will do the Washington Commanders. I have trouble saying the word Commanders. Still look at them as their old logo, but we'll do another deep dive into the NFC East, and I'll be back with that. Thanks again. See you down the road.